I was doing 160 to 200 grams of protein, and it felt like a lot, a lot of protein. It was like kind of scary to be eating that much protein because, of course, that much protein is going to destroy your kidneys and all the other stuff that we hear about it, and obviously, start gluconeogenesis and kick you out of ketosis. So for me, that higher protein level, I started experimenting 160, 200 grams. And then after a while, I started bringing it down. But the experience that I had with feeling satiated and satisfied and no longer thinking about food for me was just a revelation. And it really changed my quality of life to be able to be satisfied from what I was eating. Then I started experiencing massive body recomposition changes. So after 4 years of doing keto, I started out pretty high body fat percentage, around 38%. I got down to 34% over 4 years. And then with this high protein keto, I got down to 21% in the athletic category. And I'm not an athlete.
Good morning, everyone. Once again, welcome, Vanessa. It's great to have you back. I understand there's a new addition to your family since I last spoke to you, is what I hear. So congratulations on the new baby.
Oh,
That's
thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
awesome. And boy, girl, how old?
We had a little boy in the summertime, and he just turned 8 months, and he's absolutely thriving and the joy of our lives. He wakes us up every day with giggles and smiles, and it's absolutely amazing. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Definitely, it's definitely life changing. I got four of them. I think they're really cool. I've got my little daughters with me today. Well, they're not little anymore. They're 14 and 11. I was working out with my 14-year-old who's really, really fast. I mean, like real fast as a track athlete. So I'm trying to put her through some workouts and try to show her what the kind of dedication will take to be a good athlete. And so I think she's kind of waking up to how how hard it is to train hard. But let me where are you located, by the way? Are you still, I mean, last time I talked to you, you were in Prague. Are you still over there? Or where do you live these days?
Yeah, we're still over in Prague. Usually, we're back and forth with Colorado, but just with the pandemic and then the pregnancy, we've just been over here for now. But it's amazing. It's 18 Celsius here today. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's like summer temperatures, and the spring is starting to bloom. It's just a beautiful time to be in Prague. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah, I think it's around 70-ish, I think, 18, something like that. But well, anyway, Vanessa, for those that aren't familiar with you, can you just kind of refresh our memory? Or, I mean, I know who you are, but I mean, for the people that haven't heard before, let us know who you are.
Sure, I would love to. So I have been running Ketogenic Girl since 2015. And I used to work in finance in the stock market. And I really found that I started shifting all of my time and attention over into this work. And it has given me so much meaning and purpose in my life. I've been blogging about keto, sharing about keto, running my podcast for several years. And I actually started doing, I guess, more of like a carnivore, higher protein approach about 4 years ago. And I haven't looked back. I've been doing, I guess I started a high protein experiment back then, and my body recomposition, just the changes accelerated so rapidly that I really started doing this modified higher protein keto approach. And it's been serving me so well and serving this community that I kind of operate in so well. So it's been amazing. And it feels like such a privilege to get to just, speak and present and talk about these topics. And it feels like very meaningful work from the feedback that I get back from people.
I remember that when I remember you were doing some education, you were doing some
Yes.
classes and stuff like that, or working on something. So did you still continue with that, or what's going on with that?
Yes, I went back to school to study biochemistry at U of T. Remember, you thought it was U of Texas, and that was University of Toronto. And that really served me as well, just in deepening my knowledge of biochemistry. And yeah, it's been amazing.
So when you say higher protein, because there's a lot of different definitions of high protein. Some people will think anything above 15% is high protein. I think that's
Yes.
abysmally low, quite honestly. But as you know, the ketogenic diet has kind of evolved as a community over the last 10, 12 years. Initially it was a very strictly formulated 4-to-1, 3-to-1, very high fat approach, relatively, I mean, probably lower protein in my view. But where are you at with regard to high protein? What's high protein for you? Or what does your protein intake look like?
Yeah, so I agree. For me, the reason I use the terminology higher protein or optimal protein keto is because keto is so low on a standard ketogenic diet, coming in at around 15%. And although that can help people with getting into the state of ketogenesis, you know, if your goals are sort of like optimizing your metabolic health, and with that comes improving your body composition, then having really low protein, it can help you get into ketosis, as I said, but it's not necessarily going to help you with those goals as much. So for me, my protein percentage, I started playing with it going, 20, 30, 40, and I fall somewhere between 40 and 50% of my intake from protein. And when I first did this high protein experiment, a lot of people in the keto space like thought it was a bad idea. It was just, misguided. And I just wanted to try it out. And it was the first time in my life that I felt completely satiated from what I was eating. And that was when I was hitting these really high levels of protein. I was doing 160 to 200 grams of protein, and it felt like a lot, a lot of protein. It was like kind of scary to be eating that much protein, because of course that much protein is going to destroy your kidneys and all the other stuff that we hear about it. And obviously start gluconeogenesis and kick you out of ketosis. So for me, that higher protein level, I started experimenting 160, 200 grams. And then after a while, I started bringing it down. But the experience that I had with feeling satiated and satisfied and no longer thinking about food, for me, was just a revelation. And it really changed my quality of life to be able to be satisfied from what I was eating. Then I started experiencing massive body recomposition changes. So after 4 years of doing keto, I started out pretty high body fat percentage, around 38%. I got down to 34% over 4 years. And then with this high protein keto, I got down to 21% in the athletic category. And I'm not an athlete, so it was pretty amazing, to have that significant, improvement in my body recomposition, mostly from doing a higher protein approach.
Are you adding resistance training to that? Is that something that you do as well?
Yeah, so I did start incorporating that after, and I try to do 4 to 5 times a week right now, but I stopped for a little while when I was first pregnant, and then I started again. I was working out and doing weights up until I went to the delivery room, so I kept that up, throughout the pregnancy, and now I try to get in as many sessions as I can of resistance training. So I'm actually excited to do my next scan, because I've lost my pregnancy weight pretty rapidly in the last, several months. And I've been adding in the weight training. So, I think I should continue to see some improvement there, especially adding in the resistance training. And I think, obviously if you're eating high protein, you really want to utilize that and make the most of it, and, take advantage by doing the weight training as well.
Yeah, I think those go hand in hand. I think if you're gonna eat high protein diet, you should put the protein to work and build some muscle while you're at it. 40%. I mean, I guess it's somewhere where I eat. It fluctuates a little bit from time to time. When I want to get leaner, I up my protein a little bit. That's what happens. That's what works for well with me. There's other people that will say they do better on a higher fat approach, and I'm not going to discount that. However, you're still getting a decent amount of fat in your diet. I mean, you're eating probably more fat than the average American. You're eating more protein than the average American. And I know you're in Czechoslovakia, or sorry, the Czech Republic now. It was Czechoslovakia when I was born. So,
Yes.
but but yeah, so the fat is still, there's still essential fat. There's still a minimal amount you need. I've seen studies indicating that really anything below about 20% of your dietary calories coming from fat, and you run into real problems, and that's even in people that are eating significant amount of carbohydrate. And so, what are your thoughts on fat now? I mean, you're still talking about ketogenesis. And so, are you focusing on ketone levels? Are you worrying about fat, or how does that work for you?
Yes. So I know you were never really big into the testing. Someone who, did check my blood ketones, but I think I was kind of confused at first about what the different ketones are and how there's three different forms of ketones and how they work in different ways in the body. And so studying biochemistry helped me to understand that there's three different forms of ketones and the way that we express and utilize those ketones matters. So having higher blood ketones is not necessarily a good thing. It's kind of like having really high blood sugar, having high blood fats or lipids. You don't necessarily want to have that if, again, your goal is metabolic health. So I continue to get most of my energy in from healthy fats, like the energy component. And I do some healthy carbs. Like I've actually been carnivore for most of the fall and winter, but now that it's spring, I'm incorporating some more carbs. And I continue to test my ketones, but I use the Tone device, which is a new breath acetone meter that I basically launched in December. And it's been really, really interesting seeing the utilization of ketones because with the blood, as you know, you're testing beta hydroxybutyrate, but then beta hydroxybutyrate is interconverted between BHB and acetoacetate, and acetoacetate spontaneously decarboxylates to acetone. So we're able to see some utilization, and Dr. Dom D'Agostino has talked about this a lot, that and you look in the research studies, acetone is a biomarker for lipid oxidation or fat burning. So we're able to see actually fat burning being maintained and even being increased on a higher protein ketogenic approach, which you kind of would expect if you understand, the role of protein in body recomposition and fat burning.
Yeah, I talked to Dom I think a week ago or something like that. We just had him on.
Awesome.
That was that's a point I've made in many occasions. The blood ketone reading very much is dependent upon utilization as well. I mean, if you're effectively utilizing it, you're not going to register high ketone levels just because
Yes.
they're getting sucked up by your muscles in your brain, and so they're being utilized and they're not hanging around
Yes.
in blood being, kind of just wasted energy. Which
Exactly.
which which may have a benefit if, like I said, if you're urinating off, like you can make the argument for, like, there's an interesting, there's a phenomenon called diabulemia that you may or may not have heard of. And so what it is type 1
Yes.
diabetics that don't take their insulin. Basically, their blood glucose goes up, but they lose weight because they pee off all their energy. And, they can just kind of crash diet type thing. So you can kind of sit there and run high blood glucose for a while, pee it all off, and then you just lose weight. So it's kind of the downside of that is, that they eventually starve to death. And that's what happened with a lot of these type 1 diabetics, particularly early on before the advent of insulin. And so wasting energy, is a way to lose weight. But at the same point, our body's designed to utilize energy and be efficient at it. So, you'd mentioned carnivore and then you cyclically in the summertime. Why do you think that is? Uh, I think there's an obvious thing. In wintertime, there's not a lot of mangoes growing around where I'm at. There's none. There's no berries. There were berries in my house. I'm up in Washington State now. So my whole yard is lined with blackberries. And from like, I don't know, late July to mid-September, there were blackberries around there that in various forms of ripeness that you could have eaten had you wanted to. Um, but now there's nothing. It's March and there's nothing out there. There was like 9 deer walking through my yard yesterday. So if I wanted food, that's what I've gotten where I live now. But so why do you cycle it that way? Winter, summertime? Is that just in line with our human nature, or is there some reason for that for you?
Yeah, I'll get to your point. I wanted to just really quickly say about the ketones. You're exactly right about the utilization because what we see on the breath is when you exercise, the breath ketones dip because you're using the BHB so rapidly that it can't be decarboxylated into acetone. And the same thing happens with fasting. So people are always like, why are my ketones going down on the breath when I'm exercising or fasting? But it's exactly as you said, it's the burn rate. So you're exactly right on that. But I do like to eat seasonally and locally. And, I think a lot of a lot of fuss is made about, the air pollution coming from agriculture and from, cows. But I find that, a much larger contributor to that is like shipping exotic fruits like all around the world for us to be able to eat in the winter. I like to eat seasonally and locally. So in the spring and summer, I love to go to farmers markets and find what's locally available. And I also find that if you eat a diet that's higher in potassium, it has a cooling effect on the body. And I think it's also why we tend to crave like salads and things that lighter fare sort of in the summer. And in the winter, I just find like just protein and fat to be extremely warming. And, like you said, there's just not a lot of like fresh mangoes and avocados available, in Prague, especially in the winter time. So it's something that I've just found myself doing every year and kind of a pattern that I fall into. But yeah, I think you should definitely try to eat locally and seasonally as much as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned the temperature differences, and that's something that, we know that, like I said, in the wintertime, you have to generate more body heat, particularly,
Yes.
if you sit inside in a warm room all day long, maybe not, but if you spend any time at all outside, you're going to need to generate more calories, or you're going to need more calories so you can generate more body heat. And that's why, these studies on, Inuit and stuff showed that they were eating tremendous amounts of food. I mean, they weren't big people. They're like, average male, 140 pounds, and they're putting away 48 pounds of meat a day. And then I know they were fond of seal oil as something they use that as something to heat their body. They felt that they would stay warmer with that. And so we do have this tremendous capacity to upregulate our heat production. And that's one of those calories out things that, is kind of not directly under our control. It has to do with, environment. It has to do with food composition and hormone interactions and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Um, so there are a lot of critics of high protein diets. I mean, particularly in the vegan communities, they think that, eating high protein is a sure way to get cancer and to decrease your longevity. What are your thoughts on that? Have you given much thought to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you have to. And I was vegetarian for a couple of decades, so I'm very well versed in all of the propaganda that they put out. But when you actually start looking in the research, and you know this more than anyone, a lot of these, I guess it's disinformation, purposeful disinformation that we see out there is not valid. As you know, you see in the research, they say that protein is bad for your kidneys. On the other hand, it ends up usually improving kidney function. And when you understand what protein is, it's, the building blocks of everything in our body. Everything in our body other than fat and water is protein, like from our skin, our hair, our organs. It's not just skeletal muscle, it's even our hormones, like even insulin is a peptide hormone. So I think that people underestimate how much protein we actually need, because we do need to eat a large amount of protein to trigger muscle protein synthesis and get enough leucine, to trigger that process in the body and prevent too much muscle protein breakdown. But we also need protein for so many other things in the body. And I think that, those protein recommendations are just far too low. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like they're going to be changed anytime soon. But there's I think Dr. Stu Phillips did the most comprehensive meta-analysis on whether or not higher protein diets were, had an adverse effect on the kidneys, and he found that it was absolutely not true. I think the same thing goes for the cancer, risk equation. I know you've talked about that ad nauseum. Most people here probably aren't afraid of it either. But yeah, I think I've only seen improvements in my own health and that of others from eating more meat and more protein.
Let me ask you a question. This is something that we see, and I honestly, I mean, the answer is I don't know the answer to this, if it's good, if it's bad. Often people will see, often it's a mild increase in blood glucose with a higher protein diet relative to a very high fat diet. We're talking, some people will sit there, they'll be like, well, I was in the 80s and now I'm at 92 or something like that. Did you notice that, as someone who has frequently checked? And if so, was it concerning to you?
Yes, and I've actually recently changed my thinking on this. So I have spoken with, our colleagues like Dr. Don Lehman, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who have, talked about how they've seen this in the clinic. They've seen higher cortisol and higher blood glucose. I used to think that it had to do with different physiological things happening at night. I now think that it can be related to someone eating an excess amount of calories or an excess amount of fat. And I have seen people who have brought down some of their fat intake if it was in excess of what they need and seeing lower blood glucose from that. So I don't have a definitive answer on it either. I do think though that, for some people they may just be like running higher blood glucose, and we don't know what a lot of our blood glucose ranges really mean. We extrapolate a lot of conclusions from what we see, but we don't know necessarily like how much insulin it took to get the blood glucose that low. Or sometimes people have lower blood glucose on a standard American high carb diet because, of what's happening in the night. So, you know, I I think that it depends on the person. It's a case by case thing, but if someone is waking up consistently with really high blood glucose and, they're eating a diet that may be extremely high in fat and it may be beyond their caloric needs, it could be related to that and maybe some energy toxicity happening there. But that's just something that I've started to change my thinking on recently.
Yeah, it's interesting that, certainly, I mean, there's an overall energy intake and, how we distribute in the body either through free fatty acids versus, glucose or ketones, typically. I mean, there's energy in and there's energy going to be floating around the body, and then how we partition it out may vary from person to person. And, when I look at diabetic pathophysiology, the reason we're concerned about diabetes or high blood glucose is that its association with, kidney disease, retinal disease, cardiac disease, all the things that go with diabetes. And the question becomes, at what level is that a problem? Is that level the same for all persons? We tend to have a one size fits all solution in medicine. And so everybody that has a blood glucose over 126 milligrams per deciliter is now considered, you know, fasting, two consecutive fastings now considered diabetic. In 1980, that was 140. That number was changed. And why was it changed? I don't know. I mean, it could be like why the blood pressure, hypertension limits were changed recently. I mean, some of it may be just we want to qualify more people for medication. I mean, the cynic in me makes me wonder about that. If you look at the data on, again, back to the Inuit from the 1920s, when they surveyed those people, their fasting blood glucose was often in the 120s, and they were free of disease. They didn't have the it's a sequela associated with diabetes. And so my question becomes, what really is the right amount for people given different situations? Maybe a 120 blood glucose in somebody eating a standard American diet is a disaster, where if you're not eating a standard American diet, maybe it's not as big of an issue. And I don't know the answer to that. It's something that would be interesting to see. And again, as we have a relative paucity of data on us and people like us that eat, not a bunch of junk and mostly a lot of protein and meat, and, do we have different numbers? That's still, to my mind, an unsettled, question. There's a lot of people who want to be on the safe side. I want to keep my blood glucose as low as possible. There's a guy, Richard Bernstein, he's type 1 diabetic, and I arguably has different motivations for that. But he'll say average blood glucose should be 83. I think Peter T has been quoted as saying that as well. I don't know if he still believes that number, but to me, I'm more concerned, quite honestly. I know this is kind of controversial, but I'm more concerned with body composition and function. I think that's a better metric of where you stand metabolically than what
Yes.
any particular biomarker might be. Having said that, I don't know for sure, and I may be wrong, and I don't want to tell people to ignore this stuff. But I just kind of look at what seems to make sense from a macros perspective, just because I think there's so much of this stuff we just don't know. And I mean, honestly, we think we know, and we've kind of come down to these guidelines, and we just kind of, who knows where it came from, and we're just like, okay, everybody's accepted this, and we don't question it
Yes.
anymore. And that's the thing. I tend to look at things and question them. And so there was a study that just came out. In fact, I think Jason Whitaker was the author, looking at testosterone. I think it was cortisol. It might have been a low
Mhm.
carb diet, high protein, low carb diets, which you probably saw. And the conclusion was that if you eat above 35% of your protein, 35% of your calories from protein, lower testosterone, higher cholesterol, higher cortisol levels, dependent on chronicity and that type of stuff. And it's an interesting study. And the mainstream media took that study and said, from that conclusion, they said, if you eat meat, you're going to become infertile, which there's no anywhere in the world where that conclusion should have been made. It was complete extrapolation. And so the author, I'm going to interview that author in a couple, I think next week. He basically said that the media totally misrepresented his paper. And so he's like, this is, obviously nonsense. But I don't, did you see that paper? Did you look at that paper?
Yeah, no, I'm
Are
really
you
looking
familiar with it?
forward to you interviewing him. And it is really interesting because, I personally just became pregnant recently and found that, this approach of higher protein, higher fat, especially I was doing ketogenic carnivore when we were in the phase of wanting to get pregnant. But my protein was still around that range. And if anything, this is a time when you are in an anabolic phase, you're building a whole other human inside you. You need more protein than ever, than at maybe at any other time in your life. And so the protein requirements, for this period of time or even for fertility, I think are very low. And that, yeah, that it's one of those headlines you see like keto makes you infertile when, if anything, people in this community who work with people and do keto know that you're constantly seeing people get pregnant who couldn't get pregnant before because of lowering insulin. Obviously the problem is like the lack of studies that are done for ethical reasons, in pregnant women. So there's a lot of question marks there. But I know that, like Don D'Agostino has mentioned before, some research showing that really, really low insulin can negatively affect luteinizing hormone. But, I think that depends on the person. For me, this approach helped me to get pregnant very quickly, like within a month. And, I'm 39, like I'm not, 25. So, and had an extremely smooth pregnancy. I didn't have a single negative side effect the entire time I was pregnant. Every time I went to the doctor, he's like, "How are you not swollen? How are you not in pain? How are you not, having all of the nausea?" I didn't have a minute of nausea. I didn't have a minute of discomfort. I felt like I was just me, except I was pregnant. So, for me, it was an extremely smooth experience from getting pregnant, being pregnant, the whole way through. And Luca is absolutely thriving. So, it's shocking when you see headlines like that. And I think people just there's a big misunderstanding of what this kind of diet can be. And I think a lot of it comes down to the terminology. Like people need to understand this is a nutrient dense, healthy, whole foods approach where you're prioritizing the building blocks for life. That's the way we kind of need to rebrand it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and people made fun of me for this, but I said, look, if you're building animal cells, you need animal cells. I mean, it's just like building
Right.
animal cells. We're the same things that are in animal cells. I'm not building a brick house out of cotton. It's just like you need what you're actually doing, and all the structural supplies and the chemical supplies that go into my animal cells are contained in other animal cells. And so when I eat them, I get them in the right appropriate quantities and they're appropriate ratios rather. And I think that's just a simple kind of brain dead sort of response, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Interestingly, though, I mean, one thing I will point out, and you're probably aware of this, is human breast milk is not particularly high in protein. I mean, I think it's something around, I don't know, 10% or something like that. And it's very high in fat and also high in
Yes.
carbohydrates. And so you've got this uh, really energy intense infants, his energy to weight ratio consumption is huge. And that's something that, with these babies, particularly they're actually growing. A lot of our growth early on, these babies, their head grows tremendously. We reach an adult's head size by about age 6 or something like that, close to, or most of it. And because we have that tremendous brain growth in the first, particularly 2 years, and then up to 6 years. And so it's a lot of fat you're laying down. And so a lot of fat, how do you make fat? Well, you make it from energy, carbs, and fat in many cases. And I think that's where breast milk comes in. Do you have any thoughts on, I mean, I don't know what you do with breastfeeding or not, or do you have thoughts
Yeah,
on
yeah. I was diving into this, of course, having recently, experienced childbirth and breastfeeding. I had no issues at all with breastfeeding. I've had an abundant supply the entire time. Like Luca was breastfeeding within like hours after he was born. No issues with like latching, feeding. I'm breastfeeding him now for most of his calories. We just started baby led weaning, but I'm plan on continuing to do that for as long as I can. And my carbs during this time have been quite low, ketogenic levels. And, I really think the whole debate between, carbs and fats at the end of the day doesn't really make much sense when it comes to these kinds of topics, because at the end of the day, you're talking about carbons. Like you're getting carbons either from carbohydrates or from hydrocarbons, like from fats. So as long as you're eating enough energy, then you're going to be able to, produce these things. And I'm not saying that'll be the case necessarily for everyone, but I have close friends who do high carb diets who weren't able to breastfeed at all, So when they say that you need carbs to breastfeed, I don't understand where that comes from. I think you need to have a healthy, really nutrient dense diet and make sure that you get enough nutrients for yourself and for the and for the baby. But it's been easy for me. I'm not saying that's necessarily because of the diet, but there's genetics obviously involved as well. And I just feel fortunate that it's been really easy. And at any time, my priority was breastfeeding and the pregnancy. So if it wasn't working out, I would have changed things, and I wasn't afraid to change things either, if I had to bring in more carbs or something, but luckily I really didn't need to.
Yeah, there's studies looking at breast milk from vegetarian women, and I think vegan women as well, and they show a significant decrease in the amount of certain essential fatty acids, which are critical to brain growth. And so
Oh
that
man.
potentially is a problem, and so I think that's something that we should be aware of,
Yeah.
and then obviously when we're looking at formula, which, gosh, I think is such a disaster, with particularly when you see the ingredients that are put in formula with the soybean oil and the corn and corn syrup solids and all the nasty stuff that's in those things. It's really starting the baby. You're starting your baby off at a huge advantage to his peers. I mean, just providing normal nutrition right now in this day
Mhm.
and age, because so many people are getting this nutritionally devoid diets, as kids, and we're still able to. It shows kind of the adaptability of the human, that they can still grow and develop. But I mean, I think you're still limiting. Maybe it's 5 IQ points, maybe it's an inch on their height or something like that. But you're robbing kids of your potential by putting them on
Yes.
standard American diet or vegan vegetarian diet, in my view. I think.
Amber O'Hearn's work, you're probably aware of this, but the work that she did convinced the Canadian government to change their policy towards weaning babies onto meat because it was associated with a larger brain size. So thanks to her work, Canada recommends that to young parents. So that's really amazing. And Lily Nichols, who's another wonderful person in our community, her work influenced the policy in Czech. And for women who deal with gestational diabetes, now they recommend low carb. So those are really two superstars who've done, some really amazing work on policy change.
Yeah, let me add, this is because this is an important topic for any of the women that are pregnant that are listening to this. There's typically during pregnancy, I think a couple of times an oral glucose tolerance test will be done. If you're on a low carb diet, that may not be in your, you may not be in your advantage to do so, and you might do better with a CGM. Is that how you approach that, or what were your thoughts around the OGTT?
Yes. So I think the best, there's two things I would advise. The first is if you communicate with your care provider that you test your blood glucose and you do a low carb whole food diet. And I stay away from terms like keto and stuff, obviously carnivore, but just telling them that you don't eat sugar and processed foods and you eat, mostly just whole foods like meat and vegetables. Usually they find that to be acceptable. But I always showed them my logs of my blood glucose, and they were like, that's fine. If you don't want to do it, you don't need to do it. And they saw that obviously from how well I was doing overall in pregnancy too, that it wasn't an issue. But if someone is in the position where they need to do one of those tests, then I suggest like carbing up if that's something that you're open to in the days before, because your body is constantly adapting to whatever you're doing. So if you do the oral glucose tolerance test from a zero carb point, you will probably fail it and they won't understand that because they don't understand the context. So if you just carb up for 2 or 3 days before, then you will, you have this physiological insulin resistance that you can get, which is nothing like actual insulin resistance, as you know, but it will help if you have to do that test. But if you just show them like, this is my blood glucose from, like if you log for 2 days, usually that's really helpful, and they can see like what, you go through in the day. And if they know, you're not overweight, you're not having issues, then, it's just to think about communication.
Yeah, one of my criticisms of the oral glucose tolerance test is I'm just thinking in actual terms, this is a 75-gram bolus of liquid glucose. And I'm just like, when in the world would a human being outside of the 21st century or 20th century have ever been exposed to that? I mean, to think you would get, how would you get 75 grams of pure glucose in a natural setting? You would have to eat just an enormous amount of fruit, and you would have to, and that's not including the fructose is in there. And so just to get the glucose alone, that would be a tremendous amount to do that. So I don't think that's physiologically ever very appropriate, that situation would ever occur in real life. Now, today, sure. I mean, you go down to the name, 7-Eleven and suck down a, 72-ounce whatever,
Big gulp.
big gulp and you're there. But I mean, that's not how we're designed as humans physiologically. So it's kind of an interesting sort of thing. And there's something called a mixed meal test, which is probably a little more appropriate that people sometimes will do.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
glad
that's
you brought
something.
up this. The CGM is really interesting. I was talking to Marty Kendall. I don't know if you've had him on recently, but
I have it.
he's doing some work right now about this woman called the glucose goddess or something, and about how people are misunderstanding the CGM readings and trying to get a flat line. And so they're doing this thing like no naked carbs, where you should combine your carbs with fat. And so they're like beating the system, like they're getting this flat line, but it's just the perfect method to, rapidly gain a lot of weight and gain a lot of fat. But yeah, he's doing some really interesting work on that recently, and how, some of the CGM stuff is really interesting, but again, it goes back to like you were saying with blood glucose, like we don't fully understand what all of these things mean. Like, do we necessarily want to have a flat line? Maybe not. There's a lot of things that we don't understand and we're making conclusions on, but there's also ways that people are sort of beating the system by trying these different things. Whereas if you're going to have carbs, like maybe don't have them with fat, have them with some protein, or, same with fat, have it with protein, but never carbs and fat together.
Yeah, I mean, and there's people who discuss something called the Randall cycle, and the fact that we can't handle them both together. And obviously there's people who say, well, if you mix carbs and fat, that's perfect processed food, and that's the ingredients for overconsumption and bliss point type stuff. And and we don't overeat sticks of butter or raw cane sugar, but we certainly overeat ice cream and candy and chocolate. So it's one of those things that's interesting. And you're right. I mean, you can hack any measurement, you can hack it. You can figure out the strategy. You can probably figure out how to do it with junk food. I mean, this is a thing. So people will get around the thing. And if the metric, and that's why I said, keep the goal the goal. And for me, the goal should be body composition, function, performance, mood, all those things. If that's your goal, you know, hacking your CGM is not necessarily getting you there. Now you can use it as a tool and say, oh my God, I ate and this is the thing. I mean, it's like what behavior do you want to drive? It's like if you find out you can get away with something on your CGM, I can get away with eating all this keto junk food and it doesn't cause my CGM. Maybe I can just eat keto junk food all day. Well,
Yeah.
guess what? That's going to be the road to kind of ruin. And so I think it's like I said, keep the goal the goal. And I think we have to define our goals correctly. And CGM is a tool like anything else is, but it can be abused, it can be misused, it can be misinterpreted. And I see people that kind of do that. And I agree with you, a flat line, maybe not the best alternative. It's like saying, should my testosterone line be flat? Should my insulin line be flat all the time? And the answer is obviously no. We have, my mTOR line should be flat all the time. No, we have cyclic, pulses and peaks and valleys and all these things. And so, um, is perfectly flat the best answer? I don't know that it is. I question that, because I can tell you for one thing, when I exercise really, really hard, I'll see a blood glucose above 200. I mean, and that's like,
Wow.
oh my God, that's like awful, right? And I mean, I just did a really friggin' hard workout. I cannot believe that's bad for me. And so I'm just kind of
Yeah.
like, in fact, the highest blood glucose I ever see is generally after exercise. That's it. That's when I see my blood glucose go up, and then afterwards, it's food is a relatively minor component for that for me. But like I said, fat basically just smears the curve, right? And I've seen people where they keep their carb zero and their protein low enough where there's just nothing to smear. There's such a tiny blip with the protein, and the fat smears it out, so you don't get any rise. You might get a 2 point rise, and so you can do that. Is that ideal? Is it the best thing for your health? Is it the best thing for your body composition? Again, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a question that's not answered. I think there are other people that will say, I feel so much better on a high fat approach, mentally, cognition wise, energy wise. I feel better satiation. Some people like you and me, I feel better on a higher protein approach. I mean, I've said that from the beginning. I don't, like I said, I don't know. And maybe there's a difference for some reason. Maybe it's a sex difference. I tend to see women tend to do a little more higher fat than men. And for whatever reason. It's kind of I'll make a funny argument here. I'll be self denigrating here, but dogs, for instance, do better on a leaner diet. They don't need as much fat because they don't have as big of a brain, right? That's why dogs typically do better on lean meats. And if you give them too much fat, they have diarrhea and they crap themselves all over the place. It's a mess. Whereas, females maybe do better with a little bit higher fat approach, maybe because they have bigger brains than men and they're smarter or something. This is a funny thought, but
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of women thriving on higher protein. And, I think that especially for women who are like perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal, it can be really, really helpful. And I know that some people believe the opposite of that. But I think in general, if someone is restricting their carbohydrate intake, obviously if you're doing carnivore, you're probably already doing higher protein, so you don't really have that issue. But in the keto space, the standard approach, like you said, is 15%. And I think a lot of women can really, really thrive on higher levels of protein for sure.
yeah, and I think I've seen some criticism on the percent-based approach. I should eat
Yes.
40% of my calories, and some people say, well, let's just tie it to body weight, and to say,
Yeah.
you need X amount of protein, and then the rest kind of takes care of itself depending upon what your caloric needs are. Do you? I mean, are you like you said 107? I think you said 170 grams or something like that. I can't remember what you told me at the beginning, but
Yeah,
that's
when I did the high protein experiment, I went up to like 160 to 200, but I tend right now to average around 2.2 per kg, which is like 1 pound per gram.
right, right.
And, I think that's a great number for a lot of people. Like the range, if you're working out, if you're doing weight training, if you're not weight training, then 1.6 grams per kg, is I think a little bit more appropriate. But it depends on activity level and how much someone, like you said, is using the protein. Or even like being 20 years vegetarian, I needed those really high protein intakes at first just to rebuild my bones and rebuild my skeletal muscle that really suffered from all those years of doing such a low protein diet.
Yeah, the 1.6 numbers, obviously, I've seen Don Layman quote that number quite frequently, and then 2.2
Yes.
for weightlifters and things like that. I've seen as high as 2.6, and obviously, if you look at the work of Jose Antonio, he's done, gosh, I mean, he's done 3 or 4 grams per kilogram, without any negative sequelae. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, like, I don't know if we want to touch on this, but I mean, there's always the people say, well, isn't it bad for your kidneys? And, the sort of the misinformation that's out there that sort of unfortunately, even in the medical community, they don't seem to understand this very well, that protein does not negatively affect the kidneys. I know,
Dr. Stu Phillips meta-analysis, I think
yeah,
is
it's
what I
2018,
yeah.
right? It's 2018
Yeah.
study we did. Yeah, I've
It's
talked to Stu about that study a couple of times. And yeah, I think the whole, protein hurts your kidneys is largely nonsense. I mean, there's a Brenner hypothesis where they show that in rats. And then we see a correlation between leaking protein in the urine and kidney damage, but it's not the protein that's causing the damage. It's in fact there's actually studies that showing higher protein replacing refined carbohydrates and seed oils is actually shown an improvement in renal function. And many of the people in this carnivore community have seen reversal of their chronic renal insufficiency by going on a meat-based diet, which is almost inevitably a higher protein than what they were on before, with few exceptions. So what do you have coming up? What's going on? I mean, you got the baby, obviously that's got to take up a lot of time, I know, and there's things like that. But do you have any sort of plans for the future, or how do things look for ketogenic girl or for Vanessa these days?
Yeah. Well, the podcast, which was Fast Keto, is now the Optimal Protein Podcast, and it's been growing. We have about 200,000 downloads a month, and it's an amazing community. What I'm really excited about right now is to actually work on some of my own research using the Tone device to get some data. We're getting all these data points now from people who are testing their breath acetone, doing higher protein. And we're getting data points, people with their blood ketones, they would test maybe once a day. And now we have like people able to test a dozen times. People get up in the middle of the night and they check their breath ketones because they're like, well, I'm up. I can just check and see what it is. So I want to, put all of this data, together and publish some actual research to see, what do these things actually mean so we can start making real conclusions based on like actual data when it comes to, I think, higher protein keto. So that's something I'm really excited about. I'm recruiting some data scientists right now to help me. I've got about 100 volunteers lined up right now. So that's what I'm like the most excited about right now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see some of this data being done and science being done by folks that have a vested interest and skin in the game from a health standpoint, instead of just relying on pharmaceutical companies to do all the research.
Right.
I applaud you for doing that. One of the things, there's a device called the Lumen device, and I remember I got sent one as a quote unquote influencer, and I used it for a while, and I didn't like it. I was just like, one, it was tied to a predefined dietary recommendation. It says, well, you look like you need to be eating some more carbs now. And I'm like, no. And I couldn't put a carnivore diet in there. It wouldn't allow me to do that. And I was just like, I'm not even sure these things are accurate. And so, I was looking at the RQ, respiratory quotient. That was sort of
Yes.
the thing they were trying to determine there. And so, explain again this tone device, how it is different than the keto. I think there's what the keto mojo, which is a breath thing, or how does it um, what are we're measuring acetone, which is, obviously our ketone body that's excreted in our respiratory tract. But what are you seeing the difference? I mean, I'm sure you've compared it to blood ketones. I would
Mhm.
imagine you've done that. So what are we seeing differently? Maybe you can go into that for another minute or two, a couple minutes, just to kind of.
Yeah, I would love to. So I've delved into all the research on this. I have it on my website as well for anyone who wants to look at some of the figures. But, we have BHB, which is, the ketone that we measure in the blood. And then that is interconverted between BHB and acetoacetate, which we measure in the urine strips because the body wastes that at first when we go into ketosis or ketogenesis. And acetoacetate is then spontaneously decarboxylated into acetone. We breathe that off, and it is a biomarker for actual lipid oxidation. So with the lumen, you're measuring CO2. And I think that, it's really interesting data for sure, but CO2 levels are highest in people who eat a lot of carbs. They're lowest in people who eat fat, but they're also high if you eat high protein. So if you're doing a high protein diet, then the lumen is just telling you you're burning fat and carbs. But what if you eat high protein and you're actually burning fat? Whereas with the tone, you're actually measuring the oxidized acetoacetate. You're measuring the utilization of ketones. And so we have like a really clear picture that your body is burning fat, and we're able to measure that. And you get different levels. And it's really interesting to see, the body is very, efficient with everything it does. So it tends to put people like in a range of acetone, and you adapt to that. And then you change things up and you'll see deeper fat burning or lower numbers. And it's really fascinating. But with BHB and acetone, obviously you're measuring different ketones in different units as well. They have a correlation of about it's 0.57. So there's also a time lag of about 3 to 4 hours. If you measure your blood ketones and acetone, they're not usually the same because one is like a derivative of the other. But if you test acetone, you're really seeing a better picture of your utilization of ketones and blood. You're seeing like this storage form of ketone that you don't necessarily want to have like all this fuel in your backed up in your blood, just like you don't necessarily want to have like all this fat or all this glucose, or all three circulating in your blood. So I don't think that having high ketones really is the goal for metabolic health. It should be like low blood ketones, stable to lower, maybe blood glucose depending on your diet, and high breath acetone. And we see that in a lot of people who are like really physically fit as well.
Let me ask you, because a lot of people, and I think the folks, Stephen Finney, who's sort of backtracked on this, the initial definition of quote unquote nutritional ketosis was a blood measurement of 0.5 millimolar of ketones in the blood. And what they started to see with the Verta data says, well, wait, maybe it's only like zero point 0.3. And then we see a lot of athletes who've been on long-term, clearly high-fat ketogenic style diets, and they never register very high ketones. I never registered blood
Yeah.
ketones. The highest I ever saw was like 1.5. I mean, that's absolute highest. I think I was fasting for 24 hours, and which I don't often do. And so I'm just wondering, like I said, because I'm not eating carbohydrates, so I'm like, am I turning on my protein and glucose and using that via gluconeogenesis, and is that my fuel, or some of it coming from fat? And could I expect to see a higher reading on my tone device if I had one of those, and still have low blood ketones?
Yeah, so that's what we're seeing right now in the community. Most people are doing a higher protein approach and they are getting higher levels with the higher protein, which it really makes sense when you look at the studies done by like Dr. Jose Antonio and so many others, scientists who've looked at this. And the blood ketones, like you see Luis Villaseñor, he never gets like above zero point 0.2, zero point 0.3, but he blows like really high breath acetone. So I think that's just a really good indicator. As you said, the burn rate is high, you're using it for energy, and that's ultimately what you want. Is you want, if you are making ketones as this like replacement for acetyl CoA in the Krebs cycle, you want that to be efficient and not just like backing up in your blood. And I think we do see high blood ketones when people fast because there is this like, transition happening. But most of the time, I think if you're really healthy metabolically, they're going to be on the lower side. And that's a big paradigm shift, I think, for people who have been discouraged maybe in the past, like seeing low blood ketones and thinking that that's a bad thing when really they were just not seeing the whole picture, with the acetone in there as well.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. A lot of times, when people first go on a ketogenic diet, they notice they can taste it on their breath. They've got this thing, but I
Yes.
mean, I don't taste.
It
I
does.
never taste. I never have that anymore. I mean, I've never had it since out of very when I first started this stuff, and so can you still see higher breath acetone levels without the noticeable breath change?
Yes, I know some people always say like they have this metallic taste or they have this fruity taste, from the acetone. I never notice it myself, but my levels are consistently high on the tone. And I have five different ones that I check and cross check and everything. And they're always consistently high on that, even though I've been doing this now since, 2015. And unlike the acetoacetate in the urine, which, stops being wasted after your body figures out how to use it, and then it, diffuses it through the airways, it does stay strong. So people, it doesn't fall off like the blood ketones do in the urine.
Are you seeing a correlation between blood glucose and acetone in the breath? Is that something you've seen any kind of correlation with that?
There is a correlation. It's like 0.57 according to most of the research. So, it most of the time, if your blood ketones are higher, your acetone will be a little bit higher, but they're not the same ketone. And they're measured in different units. So it's kind of hard to compare them. But there is a correlation there, but it's not like a one-to-one at all. And it does seem to be that the higher the acetone, sometimes the lower the blood glucose. Definitely, if you look in the research, super high correlation between high acetone and low blood glucose. Like that's a very highly correlated number there.
Yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense. You're just trading one energy source for the other. Vanessa, we're running out of time. I want to give you a chance just to make sure people know how to find you. If somebody's interested in this tone device, maybe you could provide information on that, and just where your information is. I know you have the Optimal Protein podcast, I think you called it, and then
Yes.
sure you have social media, all that stuff. So let us know all those things.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, Shawn. I really appreciate it. You can find the tone device on my website, which is ketogenicgirl.com. And the Optimal Protein podcast is on all major podcast platforms. And I'm most active on Instagram at Ketogenic Girl. And you can find the tone device there. And feel free to send me a message if you have any questions about it.
Wonderful, guys. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Vanessa. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We'll be back tomorrow. You guys have a great day. Eat some steak, do some push-ups, all that good stuff. Anyway, thanks, Vanessa.
All right, great to
Congratulations.
see you, Shawn. Thank you so much.
And look forward to talking to you down the road. Bye-bye now.